righty. Let's go ahead and get started again. Everybody had bellies are nice and full. Muso gidna. Is now the best part of Israel coming to Jerusalem. That's what you look forward to. That's always what you want to come. You come to Israel because you want to get to Jerusalem. So the most important place to when you arrive in Jerusalem is you want to come to what's called the Wall. And it's also called the Kotel. Kotel just means wall in Hebrew. So if you say Kotel, it's the same word in two different. Wall is all that remains of the temple. For of course the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. You'll recall if you go back to Matthew chapter 24, Jesus and what's called the Olivet Discourse. Also found Matthew chapter 24, Luke chapter 20, Mark chapter 13. That section Jesus opens up by saying, do you see these beautiful buildings? Not one stone will remain upon another. More on that, we'll get back to that in a minute. I'll show you some pictures. But the temple was destroyed. Rome burnt it to the ground. Titus Vespasian came in with the 10th Roman Legion and actually wiped out Jerusalem. The temple was burnt. Because of that day, since 70 AD, there has not been a temple with which the Jews could come to worship at. Now, when they regained Jerusalem after the 6-day war in 1967, what they did is they did not want to rebuild the temple on top, for they feared the repercussions. Rebuild, it will mean war with Muslims. For the Muslims also worship the top of the Temple Mount, the third holiest site in Islam. Therefore, you would have a religious war if you ever rebuilt anything up there. So the Jews, rather than rebuilding, gave it back to Muslims. If you go to Jerusalem today and you climb up to the Temple Mount, it is not controlled by Jews. It's by the Warif. It's controlled by Jordanian police. Muslim police actually control the Temple Mount up on top. So where do the Jews worship? At the closest place they can get to, which is the Kotel, or the western wall of the Temple Mount. You might ask, why the west? Why not the east? Because the temple faced to the east, making the holiest of all on the western side. And the thought is the western wall is the closest they can get to the Holy of Holies where the Ark of the Covenant once stood. And therefore that's where they come to worship God. Visually, I've got to tell you, it is a really profound picture. For here you have Jews who, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 3, are blinded. They have a veil over their face so that when they read the law, they read about Moses, they read the Old Testament, they cannot see Jesus Christ. Literally, you see that because they come to worship God, yet what do they come to? A wall. They worship at a wall. They're so very close. The truth is just a little bit further in front of them, yet they can never quite get through it. They can never quite get to Jesus Christ. They're there worshiping on the wrong side of the wall. They cannot come into the holiest of all. They cannot come into the presence of God. And you see this at the Kotel. It is actually a bit sobering of an experience. For the Jews, you'll see them walk up to the wall. They come in big numbers. They come and they put their prayers. They'll stick them into the cracks of the wall, believing if they pray at this wall, God can hear them. Maybe, just maybe, God will answer their prayers because at least they're close to the holiest of all. But as much as they're close, and they bow and they pray and they have the phylacteries on their hands, the boxes on their foreheads, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5 inside, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. They're close, but there's a wall between them and the presence of the Lord. It is where they worship. It is an incredible visual picture. It is a heavy thing to realize that they are so close, yet they're not there. They are still on the outside. This is the Kotel. This is where the Jews worship. This is the holiest place in all of Judaism. Now, what gets is you can take a tour. Is right next to the Western Wall. Literally You were still in the western, but you are now no longer going to the wall, you're going under the wall. We told you when we were in Megiddo that when something is destroyed and rebuilt, it makes it taller and taller and taller. A city is destroyed, burnt, rebuilt, destroyed, burnt, rebuilt. So was Jerusalem. I told you Megiddo was about 17 times. They estimate Jerusalem has been destroyed, rebuilt, destroyed, rebuilt about 50 times. The level of the city in the days of Jesus is about 30 feet below where the western wall is today. So you have the western wall, and you're seeing there, that's the courtyard where the Jews stand to worship. The level, you'd have to go down 30 feet. They have excavated this. You can go into rabbinic tunnels. It's right next to the wall. You go down in and you get to go to the level of the street. You get to see the wall as it would have been in the days of Jesus Christ. And the very first thing there, and I got to point this out to you, I love this, is you see what's known as a Herodian stone. So if you here, do you see how the rocks here are much smaller? Mas kamay dari na lang. But here you look at this rock and it looks like a single piece of stone, because it is. This is one big rock. It is the better part of about 10 meters long. It's about 3 meters thick. It is not down on the ground. The rock about 15 to 20 feet up in the wall from its foundation. This to this day baffles architects. Because if you had a rock that big, you'd have a hard time picking it up with a crane today. If you can't pick it up today, how did they do this 2,000 years ago? There was no cranes. It's not like you got some guys throwing this up on the shoulder and saying, let's lift it up on the wall. How did you do that? They don't know. We actually have no idea how Herod moved these stones. They are absolutely massive. Not only are they big, all around the borders, they have no mortar. There is no cement. Nothing to join them. They are chiseled to such perfection, they just sit one atop another so tightly you cannot fit a knife blade between them. How they did this? They're absolutely incredibly well made. Their architecture, their design, is phenomenal. It's second to none. And Herod, you can't see it in this picture. If I go back to the Herodian stones, you might. But around his stones, you always know a Herod stone. A Herodian stone has a border he chisels around the edges, about 3 to 4 inches. It's strictly decorational. It has no practical purpose. It's just because it looks nice. And Herod did this to has not changed. It is the same structure that Herod built 2,000 years ago. For it's Mount Moriah. It's not flat, it's a mountain. Herod built up one side using arches on top of arches to raise it up. So at the far end where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is today, it's give or take about 40 meters above the level of the grade, built under arches. Underneath, it's supported with these massive rocks. That has stood for 2,000 years in an earthquake-prone area. This is why we say that Herod the Great really, truly was second to none. He was an extraordinary architect. The man had incredible vision for building, and you really see that when you go down in the rabbinic tunnels. You can see here, we're actually walking along the length of it. It's quite long. It takes you a good 15 to 20 minutes just to walk the length of this wall as you're going down. Again, this is the level of the days of Jesus. They've actually excavated portions of it here. This gives you an idea of just how far. You can see the level of the city now is up at the very, very top. That's how far down the city has been actually lowered the years. Built up, burned up, built up, burned up. That's how far it is and how far down the actual level is now at the days of Jesus. Incredible to go in there. The amazing thing again is you're seeing where Jesus walked. You're actually seeing the city as it was 2,000 years ago, and it's still standing. The rocks, the structure, the building is still still there even after all these years. Absolutely incredible to see. Well, when you pop out the far side, you come out on the Via Dolorosa. If you've ever heard of it, the Way of Suffering. It is, by the way, traditional. It is not a biblical road, but the name of the road is actually called the Via Dolorosa. You'll see the street sign, Via Dolorosa. It leads you to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Now we need to qualify. Amongst certain denominations, in particular, you're dealing with Catholics, many of your main line like Lutheran, Episcopalian, your Anglican churches, many of your larger, more high church, they hold this to be both the place of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Of people in here, a specific church to a specific denomination. There's half a major denominations, Catholicism amongst them, who hold this to be a holy site, and they go back and forth and actually exchange time on it. Funny story. Rewind about 150 years. They're actually battling who gets to come in, who gets to use it for services, when can you worship. Can you imagine one church? We can argue over things like service times, over outfits, over service. In the church, we sometimes don't get along. Can you imagine 6 different denominations? It wasn't pretty. They were constantly battling. They finally said, you know what, let's settle this. And they drew up an agreement, a very detailed agreement, about every detail of how this particular church would be used. Come in, what you could do, who was allowed in. All of it is detailed. Given about 150 years ago, everybody signed it. One thing. Sa sagwat na lang, there was a ladder down there at the bottom, highlighting it, outside of a window. They had finished signing all of this arrangement of the details of how this church would be used, but they were doing some remodel work, and there's this ladder outside, and we didn't put the ladder in the agreement. We've already signed this. It was a lot of effort. It took months. What are we going to do about the ladder? Their decision, their conclusion? Leave it. That ladder has been there for 150 years. To this day, no one will touch it because it's not in the agreement, so no one wants to take responsibility. It's going to be there till one day it just rots. That is the ladder of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Kind of funny. Shows you how well church is long. From the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, though, if you go to the north, let me see if I can zoom in for you the Jerusalem and give you an idea of our geography here. Coming in our map. So as you come into the old city, which this is Jerusalem, all that you see there, you see is a developed area with desert on the right. There's some green. You can see how once you go to the right, you're going out into the Judean wilderness. That, by the way, when you talk about Good Samaritan, going down Luke chapter 16 towards Jericho, it was a desert abandoned place. That's that going to the right. That's the way down to Jericho. The city of Jerusalem, although that's all of it, the old city is concentrated in the center. So if you look, the wall, the outline of it there, kind of gathers around like that. It kind of looks a little bit like a oddly shaped puzzle. Divided into 4 major divisions. You have the Christian quarter, the Jewish quarter, the Armenian quarter, and the Muslim quarter. So it's quartered up into 4 sections. The largest of them being the northern section. You can actually see the Via Dolorosa right there. There's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Down here, if you look at, there's the western wall, there's the Kotel, the Temple Mount. Get your destination, your geography. So there you are at the Kotel. This way, you come out to the Via Dolorosa, takes you out to the Holy Sepulchre. But if you continue going north, and you come out up here known as the Damascus Gate, which exits the Muslim quarter of the old city, you cross over the road to a place known as the Garden Tomb. For we hold that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not the actual location, some biblical inaccuracies to it. Jesus, very specifically, go back to Hebrews chapter 13, was crucified outside the walls. He was not crucified inside of the city, sagwat na lang. Paul tells us, presuming he's the writer of Hebrews, therefore let us go out and be with him. Let us go outside of the city walls as well. So we need to find a place, sagwat na lang, Turns out there, place just north of the Damascus Gate, you have this area where there's a garden. Where was Jesus buried? In a garden tomb. Right next to this garden, there's a little hill, a little mountain. This hill, it's not very high, by the way. It's maybe, 15, 20 meters high. But this little hill is called the Place of the Skull. It has this name it has for a long time. Unfortunately, the Arabs built a bus station out front. Kind of a bummer that Golgotha now has a bus station, but it's there. You can see the buses down here. But originally, hard to see in this picture here, it's a little small. But ang tsura na lang of that hill, looks like there's 2 sockets for eyes and one for the nose, which is why it was called the Hill of the Skull, Golgotha. That's what Golgotha means, is the place of the skull. Calvary being the name of the same thing, that's just Latin versus speaking it in Aramaic. So this place is outside of the city. It's next to a main road, a main highway. You might ask, why is it important? It's by a highway. Romans would always crucify people tupad sa dalan. Remember, crucifixion wasn't just a punishment, it was a warning. If you rebel, if you don't obey Rome, if you don't do what Rome says, we're going to show you the cost and the penalty. We're going to put someone right next to the road where everybody passes by to let you see the price of disobeying Rome. Next to the road, on a hill, high enough to see, outside of the walls of the city, there was this place that looks like a skull called Golgotha. Right next to that, there is a garden. We know it's a garden because they actually found a cistern that held water. Remember, there's no rain in Israel for much of the year. If you want a garden, you have to have a place that stores your water. There's a very large cistern there. Very old, tells us it's always been a garden. And in that garden, there is a tomb that is carved right into the walls of the hillside right there. It is a tomb not very large, by the way. It's not a big place. We can see that there was a channel where there's a rock that can be rolled in front of it. Importantly, it's an empty tomb. Because the irony of Christianity, and it's the fundamental truth of our faith, is we do not worship a crucified Lord. We worship a resurrected Lord. There's often been argued, in Joseph of Arimathea, who owned presumably this land, it was a generous gift of his to give Jesus his tomb. And Joseph, of course, argued, well, no, it's not. I'm not giving it. He's just borrowing it for 3 days. I'll get it back. Because Jesus didn't stay. Because the tomb is not there. In fact, they used to have this amazing, they took it down, this amazing sign in the door as you walked in. He is not here, for he is risen. Neatest place to go. By the way, we always do communion when we go here. It's a wonderful place to partake of the Lord's Supper. To see the fact that we do not serve a crucified God. We serve a resurrected Lord. This, presumably, now mind you, we're not dogmatic about this. We don't sit there and say, absolutely, this has to be the place. It does seem to fit all of the criteria. It lines up very well with the biblical description. But the important thing is not so much where, it's that Jesus is risen. And this, by the way, is run by a non-for-profit. They're a wonderful organization. They charge nothing to go in here. And they'll tell you all of this. They'll enforce and kind of reinforce the idea that, listen, we're here to worship Jesus, not a place. But it is an incredible place to go to, an amazing place to see, because it is an empty tomb. Now, when we're done with that, typically what we end up doing is shooting over to the church, because there is actually a Calvary Chapel in Jerusalem. Some dear friends, I was actually there for quite a while and have built some relationships with people, so typically go and guest speak there. What's funny is it's not a Sunday morning service. If you are going to church, regardless of whether you're a Christian or a Jew, if you're going to church in Israel, you will go on Friday night. For the Shabbat is from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday, and everything stops. In fact, we always plan our days on Saturday to get out of Jerusalem, because if you're in Jerusalem, you would do nothing because nothing is open. The Shabbat is so extreme. A couple quick stories on this one. If you are in a hotel, which inevitably you are, in Jerusalem, be careful. Not every elevator is the same. You have a regular elevator. Walk in, push your button, go where you want to go. It's nice. But there's also the Shabbat elevator. Because the Jew is not allowed to do any work. If you push a button, that's work. Well, how do you get around that? It stops on every floor. You never have to push a button. So if you get in the wrong elevator, the Shabbat elevator, and you're in a tall building, 20, 30 stories, it's going to take you a while if you're at the top because it stops at every floor you're going up. Welcome to Shabbat. This is Saturday in Jerusalem. There was even a funny story. Jen, I don't know, where's Jen hiding? She's in the back. We're having dinner one night. It's Friday evening. The Shabbat has started. The Jews all come out because they can't cook. You're not allowed to cook your meals because it's the Shabbat. That's work. So they'll go out to eat and they'll have all the Gentiles cook for them. Yeah, all the Arabs or whoever, non-religious Jews, they can cook and the Jews will just eat that. So they're full of the hotel. It's full of these Jews. And so we're having our meal, Jews all around us. Jen forgot something in the room. So she runs up to get it. She takes a long time. Comes back down and she's got a rather perplexing look on her face. What happened? Why did you take so long? She said, you're not going to believe my story. She goes, I went to my hotel room, I got what I needed, and I was walking back, and a Jew walked outside of one of the Hasidic Jews, meaning they had the hat on, the curly beard, one of the ultra-Orthodox, walked out of his room, and he stopped me. Just the two of them in the hallway. Jim was a little nervous just because being alone with a man was kind of a weird thing. She's like, yeah. But would you please come in my room? No. No, I will not come in your room. Why would I do that? He goes, no. I'm a Jew. I'm not allowed to turn off my light switch. Would you please just come in and turn my light switch off for me so that I could turn it off and I'm going to go down and eat? Jen just kind of looked at him. She kind of tiptoed into the room, never all, one foot still outside. She wasn't going to go all the way in. One foot still coming outside, flicked his light switch and ran. He was very thankful. He was very appreciative for turning off his light. But this is the Sabbath. Everything shuts down. That's how Israel works, which is why when you go to church, it is Friday night or Saturday morning. So it's kind of fun to go out. Most of the Jews here, and there is a Jewish church, are Russian immigrants who've come out of Ukraine or out of Russia. They've come into Israel. They are Jewish by their heritage, but they've become Christians, gotten saved, and they come and they worship. So the service is done in 3 languages. You teach in English, Russian, and Hebrew, which is kind of entertaining. It's kind of neat. But that's the service, kind of sweet there in Jerusalem. Really neat to meet with the people. Lovely, lovely group. But then on Saturday morning, because that was Friday evening, the Shabbat has begun, you got to get out of town. Because Jerusalem shut down. Jerusalem is nowhere to go, so you got to leave. So we drive out and we stop on Mount Scopus. Now Mount Scopus is going to be up here overlooking the city. So you can kind of see that little dot there. Here's the old city down. Up here, a little bit further, maybe a half a kilometer away, it is the highest point in Jerusalem. In fact, the word Scopus is actually from the word for scope or telescope. It's where it comes from because it's the overlook of the city. And from there, you get your very best views of the Temple Mount. There's really none quite comparable to it. So you can kind of see, you're looking down over the city, you're down looking on the Temple Mount with the Dome of the Rock there. That's the Muslim monument. More on that a little later. But that's what you're looking down on. Beautiful view from Mount Scopus. Kind of a neat perspective. And we begin our drive. It's about, give or take, about 40 minutes. It's not too far. But you're going to drive from Jerusalem all the way down till you come to this spot right here at the northern end of the Dead Sea. This, by the way, is the route that would have been taken by the Good Samaritan. This is the route into the Judean wilderness. Jericho would be just a little bit north here. You can see Jericho there on the map. See a little highlighting it there? All right, there's Jericho. So you can kind of see if you're coming from Jerusalem, going down to Jericho, you're going to come down this way. It always has been the road, always been the way down into the wilderness. You go down the whole time. Jerusalem is 1,000 meters above sea level. By the time you get to the Dead Sea, you are about 500 meters below sea level. It is the lowest place on earth. There is none lower than the Dead Sea outside of going into the ocean. You can go in the ocean and get deeper. But if you want air to breathe, the Dead Sea is the lowest place you can ever get. It is the lowest spot on earth. So you're driving down the whole time, and when you get there, the first thing we do is we find a gas station because they have camel. And how often do you see camel in the Philippines? So everybody likes to get a camel ride. It's super fun. They're just walking around the parking lots, all they do. I think it costs 500 pesos. So not too expensive for a camel ride, and you can say you rode a camel. Super fun, so you go on your camel ride there as you first come down to the Dead Sea. But once you leave the gas station there, you're going to come over to a place called Quam Ram. Stop right here. This is where we start getting interesting. Quam Ram, the desert this is. It gives you a picture of just how dry really Israel is. Unusual, this is the appearance of most of Israel. There's nothing green, nothing growing anywhere. The Dead Sea, nothing grows down there. It is an absolute wilderness. It is an absolute... Because of its very low moisture, the most important archaeological... Let me repeat that. What they found here is the most important piece of archaeology ever. For they found the Dead Sea. 1946. Little Arab shepherd watching some goats. Lost track of it. Wasn't sure. And he thought, tama mga kuweba, maybe one of them's hiding in that cave. Stone. Hucks it into the cave thinking maybe chase the goat out. Rather than a goat, he hears the shattering of a clay jar. He goes in and he finds ancient Jewish scrolls. How old are they? Over 1,000 years. Now here's what's so special. Scrolls anywhere else, and this is, by the way, we actually hiked up the Quam here. It's about a 40-minute hike. You can hike up into the cave. A bit of a hike, but it's not bad. As you get up into the caves, because there's no moisture, no rain, even though the scrolls are made of very fragile material, they did not degrade. They did not break. They were preserved because they were here. Put them anywhere else, they wouldn't have lasted that long. Because they're in Quam Ram, they lasted 2,000 years. They ended up finding some 600 total scrolls in the end, going through about 30 different caves. These scrolls were able to reconstruct almost all of the Old Testament. Just the Old, mind you. New Testament, of course, doesn't quite. That was written after this. But it was giving us a 2,000-year-old copy. They're not originals. Nothing written by Moses or David or Solomon was in these caves. They are so copies. But they're 2,000-year-old copies. Does that matter? Every one of our Bibles is translated out of what's called the Masoretic text. So it doesn't make a difference what translation you have. If you're Ang Pulang Sang Diyos, if you are NIV, NLT, NKJV, whatever you prefer, whatever Bible translation you use, all of them are translated out of one Hebrew text, the Masoretic. It is 1,000 years old. We do have the physical copies of the Masoretic. We still have them today. Israel has them in the museum. You can read the Masoretic if you read Hebrew. But it's 1,000-year-old text. The Dead Sea Scrolls doubled that. You just went 2,000 years back. Here was the question everybody asked. How different were they? How much of the Bible changed between 2,000 years ago and 1,000 years ago, between the Dead Sea and the Masoretic? It was negligible. Essentially, none. They are identical. And that should not surprise us. But what it tells us, what it proved, is our Bible has integrity. What God put down there, the very text that Jesus was reading, because you're predating Jesus with the Dead Sea Scrolls. Theological finds because it validates for us the authority and unchanging truth of our Bible, Old Testament. This is the Dead Sea Scrolls in Quam Ram. We'll get here, Duga. We're going to show you where they actually have these. You can see the scrolls, amazingly, but this is where they found them. Just as a quick side note, you might ask, who put them there? We don't know for sure, but it's believed there was a group of men called the Essenes who were separatists. They believed in the coming of the Messiah. They believed in the end of the world. They have other writings that we find talking about this, who withdrew themselves from Jerusalem to live a very solitary life out in the wilderness. Some believe John the Baptist might have come from this particular group of Essenes. There's no direct connection, but there is some assumption they draw concerning this. Though they were wiped out, they were all killed in 70 AD. When Rome came in and destroyed Jerusalem, they followed then down towards the Dead Sea. I'll show you why in a second. But needless to say, they wiped out the Essenes, which is why the scrolls were forgotten. Good thing they were. So we could find them 2,000 years later and know that our Bible is true. So Qumran, incredible, incredible sight. But from Qumran, we head further south. We're going to go almost 2/3 of the way down the Dead Sea to a place called En-Gedi. Now, two things. It's worth mentioning that En-Gedi is beautiful. It's this radical contrast. When you are outside next to the Dead Sea, the temperature, 50 degrees. Mind you, you're a good 500 meters below sea level. It's hot. It's warm. I mean, it's a desert. It is miserable, and there's no water to drink. You touch that Dead Sea, don't put that in your mouth. You do not want to drink the Dead Sea water. It is actually lethal. It has such a high salt content and mineral content, you would not do well if you drank it. Seawater, but none to drink. Hot, sweltering, miserable. Suddenly you turn a corner and you go into a small little canyon, and there's just green everywhere. There's birds, there's lots of little animals. They have goats. The name En-Gedi means the spring of the wild goat. Mga kanding. And they're full of them. They're everywhere you look. And this water is fresh water. It's not salt water, it's fresh water. And the temperature drops about 15 to 20 degrees. Rather than 50, you drop down to about 30, 25. And you're going, whew, this is nice. So nice. This is where King David hid from Saul. When you remember, he had to flee from Saul, and he hid in the wilderness of En-Gedi. This is exactly where David went. And by the way, it makes so much sense when he writes, "Soul longs for, like in a thirsty land." And you start to realize when David's writing these beautiful psalms, like a deer pants for water, so my soul longs after you. And here he is looking out from this beautiful, beautiful oasis out into the sweltering desert that is the Dead Sea. You start to realize what David was talking about, how he related it to his relationship and his need for God. And you're standing here and you're going, I get it. You can see why David was so inspired by it and why it was able to support, by the way, 600 men as they head out from Saul there in the canyons and the wadi, they call it, of En-Gedi. So quite an beautiful hike walk, by the way. The Israelis love the nature of it. It's always full of people, huge crowd in there because it is just a beautiful place, but biblically amazing because of King David and King Saul. But from En-Gedi, we go a little further south. We're going down a bit more. We go to a place called Masada, also known as Matsadah, if you want to pronounce it in the Hebrew. Masada is sobering. It is not a fun place to go to. It is a large plateau. It sits about 500 meters above the level around it. And if you can see, every side is a cliff. Flat on top, tapan sa babaw, but palibot na lang, it's all very, very tall cliffs. The thought behind this was Herod the Great wanted a winter fortress. Someplace he could go during the cooler months of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem can have snow. It gets cold enough, pwede mas snow sa December and January. So let me have a winter kind of a palace to go relax at. He builds this down at the Dead Sea. He builds it on top of a plateau so that it is absolutely defensible. You cannot come at this. You cannot attack this. From all sides, you're untouchable. He put up there a luxurious palace, hot and cold baths. You're in the Dead Sea. There's no water. How did he have hot and cold baths? He carved channels all throughout the plateau to get what rain came. Maybe it rained once a year. All that rain would be funneled into huge cisterns. So there was ample water up there for large amounts of people for a long period of time. He made this absolutely incredible, this beautiful palace. When Rome came after the Jews in 70 AD, there was 1,000 of them, isa kalibo na lang, that fled to Masada for safety. Titus Vespasian followed them. The 10th Roman Legion came after them. They set up camps. In fact, the camps you can still see. If you look, if you can see it well in this picture, but there are some encampments that are not really obvious in the blurriness of this. You can actually see the boundaries still 2,000 years later of the campsites of the Roman armies who surrounded but could not take out the Jews on top of Masada. It was completely defensible. You couldn't get up there. So what did the Romans do? They had a brilliant solution. Do you see this here? This large hill. That's not natural, it's man-made. The Romans took slaves from Jerusalem that they had captured. They brought them down to the Dead Sea. And over the period of about 6 to 8 months, they built a huge siege ramp all the way up to the top of Masada. They knew the Jews would not harm them because they were their brother, and they would not shoot arrows down at them because they were their own countrymen. Once they built this, they brought up a siege ramp to break through the walls, the fortifications, the pader lang, balibot lang sa babaw, that was protecting the Jews inside. What did the Jews do? They knew they were done. The men, tanang-tanang mga laki, gathered together in the synagogue. There is a synagogue on top. In fact, usually when we tell this story, we'll go into the synagogue. The men sat down. We have the shards of clay that have the names written on them. They knew they had a choice. A, we surrender. We'll probably still be killed. Our wives, let's not think about what will happen to them. Our children will be raised by Romans as pagans. They will lose their faith in God. Or we die. Option B. The men said, we prefer death. So they got the shards of clay. They put their names on them. They basically had a lottery. The lottery was the last man would be the one to kill himself. They then all went to their homes. Beginning with their youngest child to their wife, they murdered their whole family. Willingly. It wasn't an unwilling act, presumably, we don't know for sure, but they killed their whole family. The men then came back to the synagogue, and they killed each other till only the very last man who drew the clay shard had to kill himself. So when the Romans came in the next morning, they broke through the wall, expecting to find a battle. They instead found a graveyard. Everyone was dead. This is a place the Jews now require every single citizen to go to. If you're not aware, Jews require military, men and women alike. Men serve 3 years, women serve 1.5 years. It's mandatory after high school. Part of your mandatory military service, you go to Masada. And what they'll tell you is never again. If you want to understand the Jews, this is where you want to go. This, and we'll get here in a minute, and Yad Vashem. Because the Jews are saying we will never be in a place again where we have to choose between suicide and losing who we are as a people. Sadly, that's not necessarily so. We know from the Bible, bad things are coming. The Lord will still fight for them. They ultimately, in the end, will be protected. They will ultimately, at least 1/3 of them, will go into the millennial kingdom. But this is the defining psyche of the Jewish mindset. Never again do we want to be Masada. This is why they have a story that is so strong. This is why they put so much effort in protecting themselves, because they never want to see this happen again. Masada, heavy, but powerful to see. Well, from Masada, we go one last step south. We go down to this southern part of the Dead Sea. Now, if you're wondering why it looks different, obviously very different appearance. Up here, much darker. Down here, kind of broken up and lighter blue. And Jews are smart. They figured out something pretty cool. They realized the minerals inside of the water of the Dead Sea are extremely valuable. It is one of the most prolific sources of magnesium in the world. How do you get it? Put it into evaporation pools, let the sun take it away in that hot weather, and you're left with the minerals you want. So what you're looking at are evaporation pools down at the southern end of the Dead Sea. But it also has some incredibly good swimming. So you can go down, and it's a great place to go and hop into the Dead Sea. Warning, do not shave, do not have any cuts, make sure wala pilas, because you will suffer. It is the saltiest water you have ever seen. You can't sink. You get in the water. If you lay down, you just bob like a cork. It's tough to put your legs back under you and stand up again. It's hard to get your feet back down in the water. It's so buoyant. It's 30 times the salinity of the ocean. Nothing can live in there, which is worth mentioning. Here's a question. What makes the Dead Sea dead? The Sea of Galilee, by the way, same exact water. Full of fish, full of life. The Dead Sea, Jordan River flowing into it, same water that comes out of the Sea of Galilee, nothing different. Water's the same. Dead Sea has no life. None. Why? No outlet. The Sea of Galilee receives and gives. The Dead Sea only receives. And it makes it dead. Beautiful. I'm guaranteeing that's not accidental. God planned that. Beautiful picture, because we know, go back to Paul writing out of the book of Acts chapter 20, verse 27, it is more blessed to give than to receive. Beautiful picture. Dead Sea, Sea of Galilee, awesome example of that. But when you get down there, it is fun to get in the water. It is fun to try to float around. It's fun if you want to even pick up. If you look at it, see if I can give you an example of this. This will give you some idea what this looks like. It's absolutely amazing. The water's gorgeous, but it's just got nothing living in it. Look at this as someone grabs a handful of sand out of the bottom. This is pulling some sand out of the Dead Sea. Look what it's made of. It's just salt. Pure salt. You walk in it. When you walk on it, it's a really weird feeling because you're expecting to feel sand. You don't. You feel chunks of salt underneath you. It will, by the way, do wonders for your skin. If you want to have a really high-end mud bath or you want to get a nice exfoliation, go to the Dead Sea. They pay lots of money for it. It's amazing that way. But picture-wise, awesome because it shows us men don't just receive, make sure that you're also giving. Well, that makes a Saturday. We head back up to Jerusalem. It's about a 2-hour drive back up into the city from all the way down to the south. But the next day we change course. We're not in the old city. We're going to go out to the outlying areas. So we're going to come first and foremost out to what's called the Israeli Museum. 3 things here you want to come to. The first one, probably the most important of them, is the Shrine of the Book. They actually designed the building to look like the top of the clay jars that held the Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you're wondering what that unusual kind of a rooftop is, it's meant to look like the clay jars, the top of them, that they actually found the scrolls inside of. There, you can't quite see, it's cut off a bit for you. I apologize, it's a bit low. But if you can see to the bottom of your screen here, that is the scroll of Isaiah, intact. It is 22 meters long. Get an idea? You kind of think about a Bible today. We have our Bibles, and some of you have large, I've seen those. They're a little bigger. Some of you like the small Bibles, the compact ones, your youngins. You bought that by, you can still see the young small print. But in the days, the way if you wanted a Bible, it wasn't something you put in your hands. This is why Bibles were restricted just to the synagogues. One single book, and it'd be 22-meter long scroll. Unroll it, you can unroll piece by piece by piece. It was quite long. What's incredible is that was all preserved for us. You can go. That scroll, it is identical. If you read Hebrew, it is identical to what the Hebrew Bible is today. There is no differences. The scroll written 2,000 years ago is the exact same Hebrew that you would have from your Old Testament today. The whole book is preserved for us, the whole book of Isaiah. They have it on display there. It's amazing. And they have more there too. They have a whole bunch of different Dead Sea Scrolls there for you to look at. But they also have the model of Jerusalem worth looking at. So when you talk about Jerusalem, this is the Temple Mount. So this is what we'll be up on here in a minute. This would be the temple facing towards the Gate Beautiful. So what you would have where we're standing right here, getting the picture, this would be the Mount of Olives. On the east side, looking down on the temple, going through the only gate that led into the Temple Mount, Beautiful Gate or the Golden Gate, either one works, leading you into the courtyard that would be the temple. As you came north, this is the fort where Pontius Pilate would have judged Jesus to death. You would also have on the far side, this is where your pools of Bethesda are. This is where you would have had your, we'll get there in a moment, ceremonial washing of the animals. And then coming off of this, you'd have down here the steps of David down into Mount Fell. So you kind of get a picture and a scope of just what the city would have looked like in the days and the time of Jesus Christ. The model is very useful for it. So it's kind of fun. It's rather large, actually, as a model, but it's fun to stand and go, what did the city of Jerusalem look like in the days when Jesus Christ was there? So the Jerusalem model, super fun to get that scope and that idea from. Kind of point out all the different geography. But as you go inside, they've got some incredible artifacts in the museum. Recall I told you about a stone that said Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea? That's the stone. This is what they found in Caesarea Maritime, stating that Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea. They have the actual sarcophagus, if you will, a coffin, if you will. A little different in those days because they were smaller. They would decay and put all your bones together. But the sarcophagus of Herod the Great. They actually have Herod's. Go see it. You touch it if you want to. The Jerusalem Museum, philosophy. There's no gates. No walls. There's no separation. They have a belief you ought to be able to touch these things. Really be able to put hands on them and recognize these are real pieces of history. They ask for, and they do have cameras everywhere. Lots and lots of, but there's no separation. There's no walls. There's no barriers. See, there was saw a story, a young boy, over accidentally, it was an accident, a 2,000-year-old piece shattered it. And he was devastated. I mean, he thought for sure he was going to prison, and they went, no, you're fine. And it was very sad, and they did their best to put it back together, but they said, we want you to have access. Really, it's an unusual museum. They want you to be able to get close to these things, to see it's not just words on paper, it's history. This is truth. This is real. This is actually things that took place, and they have all of the artifacts to show you that. It's entertaining. That is our worship. These horns are enormous. What animal was that? This is the biblical Arok. You read about they have ceased to exist. They've gone extinct in the past about 1,000 years, but they were basically cows that weighed about 1,000 kilos. Enormous. They were quite prolific in Israel, and they've actually found the remains of them. Wild people talk to them. You go to the book of Job, mentions them, but you go, well, what is that? Well, you can go to Israel and actually find the remains of them. They have the ruins of these animals that you can actually see every day. Kind of amazing to see that. But from the Israeli Museum, we're going to go south. You're still in the city of Jerusalem. If Masada was sobering, this is called Yad Vashem. Yad means the hand. Shem means the name. And it carries this idea of hold on to the name. Don't forget their names. The Holocaust Museum. You can't, by the way, this had to be a stock footage. You can't take any pictures. It's for. In fact, anyone younger than the age of 11 is not allowed inside. Not because they do not want someone to see it, but because they make the assumption someone under the age of 12 couldn't handle what they're going to see. They take you through how they're not familiar with the Holocaust. It is what Germany did, specifically Adolf Hitler, in 1939 through 43, 44, as he gathered together 6 million Jews and systematically murdered them. He made it into a machine. He would ship them off on rail carts. They have the carts. They still have the trains. They have the boxes they were shipped in. He would bring them out to camps like Auschwitz, places that were known as death camps. They would unload the people. They would strip them naked. All of the belongings, they still have piles of them. They would gather together. You would then walk in to take a shower. They would pack 40, 50, 60, 100, 200 people into a small room with shower heads. They were shower heads, but water did not come out. What came out was cyanide gas. Killed them all within minutes. They would then open up another door. They would bring out all the bodies. There were furnaces right outside. They would dump them into the furnaces and burn them to murder them in mass. It slaughtered millions in a very short amount of time. And all of it very soberingly documented in Yad Vashem. The hardest place to go into is when you come out of the museum itself, which was that long building that you... There's what they call the crypt of the children. So you walk into a room, it is dark. You hear names, ages, and nationalities being read. After another. It just keeps reading over this person, this place, this age, this person, this place, this age, softly in the background. As you come into a room, there's a catwalk raised up with mirrors around the entire room. Walls, floor, everything is mirrors around you. In the center of the room, there is one candle. That one candle, because there's mirrors everywhere, gets reflected infinitely in every direction, like you're walking into a star field. And what is the names, ages, and nationalities of all 1.5 million children. It's the one place you walk out of and you're just in tears. Who could ever do that to somebody? These are adults, they've done nothing wrong. They were kids. They were ripped away from their homes, ripped away from their families, and they were just killed in mass. It is probably the most horrific example of the worst of humanity you will ever see. And the whole idea behind the museum is don't forget. It's not even called a museum. Yad Vashem fits. Hold on to the name. Because again, this comes back to never again. But the hard part about this is we know it will happen again. For when the Antichrist comes to power, go back to Revelation chapter 12, he will pursue the people of God. He will pursue the Jewish nation. That's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 24, verse 15, when you see the abomination of desolation, run. Run as fast as you can, for a time is coming such as has never been and never will be again. Yeah, the Holocaust was bad. Something worse is coming. Which is why we pray for Israel. Because there's never been a people ever persecuted like they have. There was a movie, Fiddler on the Roof. Don't know if you ever saw it. Wonderful movie, by the way. Highly encourage you. Amazing, amazing movie. Speaking of Russia, turn of the 19th, 20th century. And the lead character, Tevye, he's the father in the movie. He has this statement that I always thought was perfect to define the Jews. He said, Lord, I know we are your promised people. We are your chosen people. But couldn't you choose someone else just for a little while? Because man, have they suffered. And you see that really Yad Vashem is a sobering, humbling reminder of what it's cost Israel to be the people of God. Well, that night, we go out back to Jerusalem, kind of fun. We'll go see the Night Spectacular, a beautiful display they have commemorating the history of Israel. You go into what's called the Citadel of David. It's actually not David's castle, but they just call it that. But they project onto the walls the history of Israel. It really is quite remarkable to see. So you're actually looking at just the actual fortress, the citadel, but they superimpose over it these projected images showing the history of Israel throughout the ages. This is dealing with the Byzantine portion on into the Ottoman portion. Really kind of cool to see, a wonderful night just to kind of relax, especially after Yad Vashem. What will we do the next morning is what gets the best. For we head back into the city, and we go up onto the Temple Mount. So the Temple Mount is going to be that roughly square area right there. You kind of see rectangular along. That rectangular area down at the south, this is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, a Muslim worship place. Okay, this is actually the holiest, third holiest of Islam. Not this that you think of as the Dome of the Rock. That is not actually where they worship. Monument, not their place of worship. The mosque is a holy place. But this whole area here, all of this, is what we call the Temple, or the Western Wall is right here, just outside of it. Jews, very hard for them to get up there. They had to have armed escorts. There were men with fully automatic rifles surrounding them in order for the Jews to go up on the Temple Mount. It is a very contentious place. You cannot bring a Bible. Absolutely forbidden. We're talking you would go to prison if you Mount. You cannot pray. Do not raise your hands. Do not worship. Do not praise song. You will start a war. This is hotly contested. It is a very cautious place to be, to the point of where when we went up there, Jersham was just holding the hand of his wife. That was it. Husband and wife holding hand, not big deal, right? Of course you're going to do that. You're there with your wife. Man ran over and broke them up. Demanded to delete any photos they'd had together. This is a Muslim holy site. Here it's not for Allah. Interesting place to go. So you come onto what's called Robinson's Arch, the main entryway for non-Muslims. We can't walk in the normal gates because we won't say God is great. We won't follow the Muslim tradition. So we have our own little entrance. When you come in, you come up these stairs to the top, a place called the Dome of the Rock. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is behind you. We don't go in there. Go in there if you're not Muslim. We come to the Dome of the Rock. You can't go in there, by the way. You have to be Muslim to enter there. Not that we would care. The rock, so I call it the Dome of the Rock, supposedly Muhammad leapt off from when he left back to go to heaven. He did his night ride into heaven. Some winged horse took him into heaven. That's Muslim theology. The place where it took. That's why they put the dome there to remember that by. It's been there for about 1,400 years, built in there for a long time. Some argue that's the location of the holiest of all. Not likely. There is a place a little further. Let me zoom in on the Temple Mount here. So if you are here, this is the Dome of the Rock. Do you see the DVD gray dome up towards the top? Kind of hard to spot. A little bit of a speck right there. It's called the Dome of the Spirit. Here's what gets interesting. Gate, which has always been the Golden Gate, always been the gate beautiful. If you look at that, it does not line up with the Dome of the Rock. It lines up with the Dome of the Spirit. If you're looking at the flooring there on top, everywhere you're up on top of the Temple Mount, it's all these formed tiles, man-made tiles. Herod put them in place. They're still there to this day. But when you come to the Dome of the Spirit, there's no tiles. It's bedrock. It is the top of Mount Moriah. What is it most likely that you're standing in? By the way, it's kind of a fun place to stand too. Most likeliest of all. You were standing in the very spot where the Ark of the Covenant used to stand in the days of Solomon and before, where the presence of God used to be, where you come down with a cherubim. It is an incredible opportunity. Now, what makes that super interesting, because of course the Ark is no longer there, the temple is no longer there. But when the Antichrist comes, according to Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, he will rebuild the temple. He'll make a covenant with the people of Israel for 7 years. This covenant to rebuild the temple, presumably because there is a temple according to Revelation chapter 11, verse 1. This covenant to rebuild the temple, where are they going to build it? If you destroy the Dome of the Rock, if you dared to touch this, that's World War III. If you touch that, 1 billion Muslims are going to come after you. You can't touch the Dome of the Rock. So where do you build the temple? To the north where it was originally, at the Dome of the Spirit. If you build the temple in the dome of the Spirit, it puts the dome of the rock in the court of the Gentiles. Which is interesting because according to Revelation chapter 11 again, we're told that they didn't measure that. That was given over. So that's just abandoned. The outer court is abandoned. And so it would allow for the rebuilding of the temple next to the dome of the rock, which would bring about the tribulation. This is the covenant the Antichrist will make. We'll rebuild that right there to begin that final 7 years of wrath that God predicted and talked about, going back to Matthew chapter 24, Luke 21, and Mark chapter 13. So incredible to be up there. Amazing to see that dome of the rock. Questions on that one, by the way? Make sure no one's got questions on that. Good, Pa? Actually, Chaddy and Eric are like, eh. You want to move a little bit? From the Dome of the Rock, you're going to go a little bit further to the north. You're going to cross over, and you come to what's called St. Anne's and the Pools of Bethesda. Here's, John, what you were asking about. This is just a touch to the north. You have what they call the twin pools. There's actually 5 of them in all. They're rather deep. They're about 6-7 meters deep, where they would have stored water to allow for the sacrifices at the temple. You go out what's called the Sheep Gate there on the northern end of the Temple Mount, and it brings you out to this place where they would have been the preparations for the sacrifice. Importantly for us, this is the location, according to John chapter 5, where Jesus healed the lame man. If you remember the story, higdat na mga tao tupat sa pool, because they believed an angel would stir it once in a while, and if you were unagid, first into the water, you'd be healed. So Jesus walks up to the lame man and says, you want to be healed? How can I? Whenever the water stirs, I don't get in fast enough. Someone else always gets in before me. Jesus just says, take up your mat and walk. Jesus didn't need water. He didn't need superstitions, and he certainly doesn't need angels. Walk. And the man was immediately at that very moment healed. Of course, it was the Sabbath, so it caused a bit of a ruckus. It got Jesus in a lot of trouble. But that took place here at the Pools of Bethesda. Again, no water in them anymore, but this is the location where all that would have taken place. Right next to it, there is a beautiful church. Now, we only mention this because St. Anne's has the most incredible acoustics of any building I've ever been in. You get in there and you start to sing and you sound like a chorus. Even if you sing bad, it sounds good. So it is the neatest place to go into and go, all right, I am not a singer, I am not a worship leader, but this moment and this day and this place, things are going to change. So it's an awesome place to go and just worship. It is absolutely precious. It's because of the structure and how it's built. It just has a natural reverb, and it just makes your voice replicate over and over. It's a pretty neat place to go do some singing. So that's the Church of St. Anne's. It's right next to the Pools of Bethesda. But from there, cross on over, we're going to come out a little bit, back towards the Temple Mount, and we're going to come to what's called the Wall Museum, actually right here. It is the rich portion of Jerusalem. So look at your geography. So here you are on the western side of the city. You're overlooking the Temple Mount. It is a little bit higher. You're climbing up to what's called Mount Zion. So you have this nice view down upon the temple. This is where all wealthy people. In fact, the houses here, some of them had 30 to 40 rooms. I don't know about your house. I don't have 30 or 40 rooms in my house. I got like 4. 40 house, you are wealthy. And that's these mega mansions that they've uncovered here. It's called the Wall Museum, or called the Herodian House, for that's thought to be where some of the richer people were living. They're on the western slopes of Mount Zion, looking down upon the Temple Mount. Really kind of interesting to see that. It shows you some of the absolute wealth that some of the corrupt officials had. Caiaphas, Annas, some of these Sadducees, they were not poor. They had extreme wealth, and that's why they were so protective of their money and their power. And you can see that wealth in these houses that they had built. But we then shoot out, because it was closed the day we tried to go there before, to the northern end. I told you that to the north over here you have Golgotha. But as you come out the northern side of the city, you also have a little bit to the right of the Damascus gate something called Solomon's Quarries, known also as Hezekiah's Caves, or Hezekiah's Caves. When Solomon built the temple, go back to the book of 1 Kings chapter 7, there was no hammer or chisel heard upon the Temple Mount. Everything that they built with, the temple, every piece of construction material was chiseled out of rock, and then it was brought to the Temple Mount to be assembled later. In fact, one of the most verses in the New Testament is the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. That's the thought, is they were mined, they were chiseled out here, just to the north of the city, out of what's called Solomon's Quarries, also called Zedekiah. Zedekiah fled there from Babylon when Babylon captured Jerusalem. That's how he got out of the city. But these caves, this man-made quarry, is where they pulled all the stones for the Temple Mount. And you can still see, if you look at some of the geographical architecture here, there's right angles. Anytime you see right angles, that's not natural, that's man-made. You can still see the lines in this cave from where Solomon chiseled out these stones to build the first temple. You're underneath the old city at this point. You're underneath the Arab quarter. It's amazing to go in there and see that construction, to see that history going back 3,000 years to when the first temple was built. But from Zedekiah's Caves, we cross back over and we're going to go to the southern end of the city. What's called the... Let me just repeat that one for emphasis in case you're curious. I don't know why you go out the dung gate. Read into that what you will. It actually has some common sense to it. Do you ever heard the word Gehenna? Hell. Is what we think of typically as hell, but there's also this word Gehenna. Gehenna means the valley of Hinnom. The southern valley of Jerusalem, this valley down here that encompasses the southern boundary of the city, is the Hinnom. It is where they burn their... So when you go out the southern gate out of the Temple Mount, you go out the dung gate because that's out of to go burn outside of the city in Gehenna, which is why Jesus would use that picture, by the way. From when he was trying to describe eternal torment, he described a trash mound full of dirt that was constantly burning because they burned the trash. So we use that as a word picture, a representation of what eternal judgment would look like. That's that dung gate down into the valley of Hinnom. But from that dung gate, you come to called the city of David. So when you're talking about Jerusalem, not in the time of Jesus. The time of Jesus is more today. For the Temple Mount, and there's a bit of a ring here. I don't know if you can see it by the road. But this mound here, small mountain, is called Mount Ophel. Mount Ophel is the biblical city. Small, actually. It wasn't very large. But this is where David would have found his palace. They spent years looking archaeologically to find David's palace and couldn't find it. One day, someone opened up their Bible. So where does the Bible say we should look for the palace? And they used the Bible as a map to look for the city of David, to find the house of David, and they found it. They have unearthed the palace of David there upon Mount Ophel, just south of Mount Moriah, south of the Temple Mount. So you can actually go see, we'll go look at the city of David, the house of David is there. But my favorite thing to do in the city of David is Hezekiah's tunnel. I love going into Hezekiah's tunnel. Now I got to admit, I'm not the smallest guy. I'm kind of tall and a bit wide. I'm wider than some others. This thing gets tiny. Going through this tunnel, sometimes I got to go sideways and I got to bend down to get through. I can still get through, but it's kind of crouched to get through it. When the Assyrian army surrounded Jerusalem, Isaiah chapter 30. When they surrounded Jerusalem, Hezekiah knew he had source into the city. Remember the siege, if there's a siege, you must have water. So he chiseled through a quarter mile, almost half a kilometer of solid bedrock to connect the Gihon, which was the main source of water in Jerusalem, inside of, to bring it into the city walls. That tunnel, dug 2,600 some years ago, is still there. Of course, everybody has cell phones today. You should bring out your cell phone. As you're walking, all these little bright lights here, those are all their cell phones. I was holding up their cell phone. You kind of cram in, and they'll use it best. It's quite chilly. And it depends on the time of year. You go to your knees. Well, it depends how tall you are. Knees for me might be higher for other people, but it can get up to your waist. And you're walking through the Gihon Spring through, by the way, about a half a kilometer, quarter mile of solid bedrock, and it's not a straight line. It's got these crazy turns. And you're going, how did they ever connect this from one side to another when you can't see? You're going through bedrock and you're under about 100, 150 feet of solid rock. Don't know. Incredible, but it's still there to this day. You can actually walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. It's amazing fun. Really, truly shows you even something from Isaiah chapter 37. Still there to this very day. You also have in the same area the Canaanite tunnels. If you remember back from the book of 2 Samuel, when David captured the city of Jerusalem, he climbed up a shaft to take the Jebusite city. It wasn't a Jewish city. It was actually part of the Jebusites. And he actually climbed it by climbing up a shaft that they didn't think anybody could get up. That shaft is still there. You can actually find, it's called the Canaanite shaft that the Jebusites built, that David climbed up. You can actually go and look at it. Kind of amazing. It's right by Hezekiah's tunnel. But you come out of Hezekiah's tunnel to the pool of Siloam. Now this gets fun. The pool of Siloam, go back to John chapter 9, was the place where Jesus went and found a man who was blind. Bulagsha. And Jesus came to the man and offered to heal him. He spat in his eyes. He washed it out with the water from the pool of Siloam, and he was healed. Caused a big ruckus because the Jews wanted to know how was this man healed and what power. And ultimately ended up getting the man kicked out of the temple, out of the Jewish synagogue. And Jesus came and found the man and said, come follow me. All of John chapter 9, that took place here at the pool of Siloam. This pool was critical because this was the main water source for the city of Jerusalem. This is where the water came out. So when you wanted to go get water, you would go to the pool of Siloam. This is where they would gather the water even for the sacrifices. There are steps leading from this pool all the way back up to the Temple Mount. So we were there. We gave everybody a choice. You can either go up the steps or you can go back on the road and go back up the easy way. I think it was Chaddy, Eric, Chaddy's sister Maite, and myself. 4 of us said, we'll take the easy way. Everybody else said, up the steps. God bless you. I'd done it before and I kind of knew. The steps are underground, very low, very narrow, very tight. They sent off, and mind you, no one went with them. We kind of sent them on their own. I figured they were okay. Just follow the steps. They went the wrong way. They ended up getting off of the path, walking into an active archaeological site. Underground, they're walking around going, this isn't where we should be. They're seeing all these tools, all these hammers, all this stuff that archaeologists are using. We shouldn't be here. We're waiting for them up at the top. It's been an hour. We're like, was it rapture? Did we miss it? What happened to them? They finally popped on the top of the tunnel, and they told us a story that, yeah, they got lost and wandered into an archaeological site. So needless to say, the steps are still have what's called the Pilgrim's Way, which was where you would come to the city, the pool of Siloam, and you would walk up the step. There's about 500 to 600 steps up into the temple itself, and you can actually still go there. It's absolutely amazing. But when you come out of the top, you come out from there, from the pool, you have climbed Temple Mount, and you pop out just beneath these big boulders. Now, wait a minute. Where those come from? If you look to the side here, this is a to show you. Do you see the border in all these stones? I told you Herod would chisel borders. You always know when you see a stone like this, in stone. You're looking, this is the Temple Mount. Just beyond that wall, that's the Kotel. That's where the Jews are worshiping. Just straight up from here, you would see the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Why are these stones here? When Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 3, not one stone will be left upon another, those are the stones. These are the remnants of the second temple that Rome threw off the Temple Mount, cracking the laver stones down below, so massive they've never been moved for 2,000 years. This is actually the ruins, the remains of the second temple still sitting there at the base of the Temple Mount. Amazing to see that. Not just there at the base, if you go a little bit around the corner from there, you come to the Steps of David. Now, the Steps of David are on the very southern side of the Temple Mount. There are a series of steps that climb up to it. You're going to look right here. You see the Al-Aqsa Mosque is that gray building? Just in front of that, you can't tell elevation from the map, but that Al-Aqsa Mosque is about 30 to 40 meters above the level of the ground beneath it, and there's steps right there. Those steps are where Jesus was in John chapter 7. Please let me describe this to you because I love this. We're told in the last day of the feast. What feast? The Feast of Tabernacles. It's the Feast of Sukkoth. It's the feast of Leviticus chapter 23 that the Jews would celebrate. As they were there celebrating this final feast on the eighth great day of the feast, we're told that Jesus stood up and said, "If any man is thirsty, let him come unto me, and out of him will flow rivers of living water." Why did Jesus say that? Because on the 8th day of the Feast of Shavuot, this Feast of Tabernacles, the priest would take 7 golden jugs, walk down the steps of the Pilgrim's Way to the pool of Siloam. They would gather water from the pool, and they would climb back up the steps all the way to the Temple Mount, to the Steps of David. Pour the water down. Why are they pouring water down the steps? To remember how God provided water from the rock Horeb in the wilderness. Here's Jesus. You think the rock gives you water? No. He said, "I am the rock." And if you want that water that was provided by Moses and the children of Israel in the wilderness, if you want the true water, don't go to the rock that was, go to the rock that is. Come to Jesus Christ. He's directly pulling out of this reference from the Old Testament. Go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Jesus, verse 4, is the rock. He's the rock that followed them in the wilderness. And that all takes place at the Steps of David. There's a rumor. Never been able to prove this. Do you know who Neil Armstrong is? Heard the name? Walked on the moon, Apollo mission. Okay. Guy's seen some pretty amazing things. If you've walked on the moon, you've achieved. You've done good in life. He was asked, "Neil, what's the most amazing experience you've ever had in your life?" His answer? To stand upon the Steps of David. Not walking on the moon? No, Steps of David. Why? I know Jesus stood right there. There is a guarantee and assurance. You are, no question, no doubting, knowing that Jesus once stood right where you are standing. Because the Steps of David, we know Jesus was there. And those steps have not changed 2,000 years. It's still the place where Jesus, John chapter 7, cried out and said, "Come unto me, those of you who want living water." That's there, the Temple Mount, amazing. There are the Steps of David. Now, we're going to wind a little bit over to the west again. Leave behind the Temple Mount, not too far behind. We're going to come over to what's called Mount Zion, which is over here. Mount Zion, one of the 3 mountains that identify Jerusalem. The city is built on Mount Zion, Mount Moriah, Mount Ophel. Mount Ophel is the city of David. Mount Moriah is where the temple is. Mount Zion, slightly to the west. In fact, if you ever talk about Zion, go to the book of Psalms, you read about Zion. "Blessed are you, O daughter of Zion." Speaking of one of the mountains the city was built upon. This is Mount Zion. Mount Zion, you got to look at. Number 1, it's the location of the upper room. Is this the upper room? Probably not. Its architecture and its design don't seem to go back far enough. This is the traditional upper room, but it's close. It's going to be roughly in this area. Somewhere around here is where we expect the upper room to be. So around this area is going to be the upper room, kind of fun. This is where you would have had Pentecost, the day of Pentecost, Acts chapter 2, where the Holy Spirit came down. It would have been in this area on Mount Zion, where ultimately they had this encounter in the birth of the church. But right across from that, you come to a place called Peter and Calacanto, or it's also known as Caiaphas' house. So this, don't think of this as being Caiaphas' house. This is a church they built on top of it, as they often do. But you can go underneath this. There are caves underneath, cisterns. And it's believed that the bottom of one of these cisterns is where Jesus would have been held the night before his crucifixion. This is where, if you'll recall, go back to Matthew chapter 26, going to Luke chapter 22, when Jesus was being tried by Annas, Caiaphas. Peter was outside. What's Peter doing? Warming himself by the fires of the enemies of Christ. He's not being too bold, but not being too shy. All the other disciples left. Peter didn't leave, but also wasn't being too bold for Jesus. And ultimately, how many times does he deny the Lord? 3 times. And actually, everywhere you look around this place, there are roosters. They put the image of roosters all over this church. Because when Peter denied Jesus the 3rd time, the rooster crowed. And even the very top of it, you can't see from this picture, but actually in the top weather vane on top is a rooster. There's roosters all over this church. Because this commemorates the location of where Peter denied Jesus Christ and where Jesus was held on the night before his crucifixion. I think this is us walking down, yeah? Oh, yeah. Let me explain. On this particular day, you're going to walk about 25 kilometers. Let me repeat that. I don't know how often you walk or how many steps you get in a day. I don't know if you count your steps. But 25 kilometers is a lot. Much of it's going up and down hills. By the time we got here, kapoy gid. And everybody's like, my legs hurt too much to walk uphill straight. So they started walking uphill backwards because their legs were so tired. It's amazing. 25 kilometers was a long day. But from Peter and Calacanto, the last stop of the days we're going to come over here, crossing over to the Mount of Olives. Now the Mount of Olives is on the eastern slope leading down into Jerusalem. So you have this relatively high mountain. Don't get an idea of like Ken Laon high. This is maybe 100 meters at best. That slopes on down into what's called the Kidron Valley and comes up to Mount Moriah and the Temple Mount. This is where Jesus makes his triumphal entry, comes down the Mount of Olives, comes up into Jerusalem. This is that very place. This is also where Jesus had the Olivet Discourse, where Jesus talks about end-time events. He's on the Mount of Olives. When Jesus ultimately prays for God to take this cup away from me, Lord, let not my will but your will be done. There in the Garden of Gethsemane is on the Mount of Olives. This is this place that Jesus went to so frequently to teach as well as to seek the will of the Lord as he was ultimately looking forward to his purpose and his plan, God's purpose and his plan here on earth. What's amazing is when you get there, it's still full of olive trees. These trees in particular are quite large, are thought to be 2,000 years old, meaning they were planted about the time that Jesus was crucified. And they're still there to this very day. Kind of incredible to see that, amazing to go and take a look at that. That is the Garden of Gethsemane. This is the Mount of Olives. Side note, by the way, also where Jesus will return to. Go back to Zechariah chapter 14. When Jesus comes back out of heaven, he will touch back down upon the Mount of Olives. If you're looking at the mountain, let me show you the map actually. Notice this unusual feature here. So here you have the Mount of Olives. By the way, this church right here, Dominus Flavius, is thought to be a traditional location of the Garden of Gethsemane. But notice you have the Kidron Valley. Here's the Temple Mount. Look at all this. You might ask, what is all that white? Do you see it all? On the far side, you guys see it over there? I'm sorry, I keep going to the left. If you're looking at all this white here, graves. That is a huge Jewish cemetery. Why would Jews, in mass numbers, by the way, want to be buried on the Mount of Olives? Because they read Zechariah chapter 14 and know that that's where the Messiah is coming back. And the thought is, and I find this fascinating, it's in their faith, we want to be as close as we can when the resurrection happens. Even the Jews hold on to this idea. It makes the Mount of Olives actually a huge, massive graveyard because they know that death is not the end. That is the Mount of Olives. Well, as we're wrapping up our tour in Israel, we still have a couple to do in Turkey, but as we're wrapping up Israel, we do head south and pick up a couple last sites. You're going to go over here to a place called the Valley of Elah. Any guesses as to what happened in the Valley of Elah? Does anybody remember their Old Testament history? You were back in 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is where David fought Goliath. In fact, you get the idea. There's a bit of a hill right there. You can't see it, but there's one over here on the far side as well. If you remember from the story, the Philistines were on one mount, and the Jews were on another, and there was a valley between them. This is the Valley of Elah. One of the best places to pick up souvenirs. I'm pretty sure Israel must restock this every year because it's got so many of them. But there's a dry creek bed that runs through the middle of it, full of little smooth stones. Because what did David pick up? 5 smooth stones. So it's always wise to pick up a couple 5 stones there. It's a great souvenir to get. But you get these stones, and David used his sling. Didn't take 5, it only took 1 to take down the giant. This is where he defeated Goliath here in the Valley of Elah. But a little north of that, just a touch, you come up to what's called Tel Bet Shemesh. Now, Bet Shemesh, if you're not familiar, is the location of Samson. So if you remember your history of Samson and Delilah, Samson, who was one of the judges of Israel back in Judges chapter 15 and 16, all of that history took place in the area of Beth Shemesh. There's just a couple of ruins there. There's not much to it, just a couple of rocks on the ground beside the highway. But amazing to kind of see that history right here as you see where Samson and Delilah and that whole story of the book of Judges took place and is still there. The ruins are still found to this very day. And the last stop that we're going to give you in Israel is the Bell Caves. Now the Bell Caves, ever so slightly south here, is right down there. So coastally, you're kind of in the central south part of Israel. These caves are huge. What's interesting about them goes back to the book of Judges as well. You read about Amamanka Gideon, when Israel was conquered because of the rebellion and sinfulness against the Lord, they would hide, nagnagot sila. They would hide their food, hide their storage, or hide their, all their produce because they were afraid of it being stolen. This is one of the places where they hide them. They have these massive caves called the Bell Caves, and they have archaeological evidence to say that these are places where the Jews would hide out from the Midianites, the Amorites, the Amalekites, when they conquered Israel during the period of the Judges. Also, just beautiful, by the way. They're gorgeous caves. So quite a geographically and natural view as well, going down there and seeing these beautiful caves. That being said, I'm going to give you a 10-minute break. We're going to shift over and we'll finish up with a couple quick sites in Turkey. Unless you've got questions. Questions? Yes. Yes. So this is, mind you, this is all the period of the Judges. That was where you famously had Israel because you're going through that cycle of sin. Israel rebel. God would let them be conquered. After they're conquered, they cry out for a deliverer. God sends a judge. You have Ehud, Deborah, you have Samson, Gideon, you have Jephthah, all these different judges of Israel who would come and redeem them. Mabuot na sila, they become good for a season. Dugay-dugay, pasuway sila liwat, they would go back into captivity. During those periods of captivity, yes, this is what we're talking about. Nagdago sila, this is where they would hide so they could keep their produce, their stocks, their crops, and wouldn't be stolen by the invading armies. This is an example of one of the places they would hide them, which is kind of neat to see that come to life and understand that just as the Bible said, is exactly what you see. May iba nga pa man ko? Other questions? Yes, John. Most of them are going to be on animal skins because they're slightly more durable. I don't think there's any papyrus in the Dead Sea Scrolls. I could be wrong on that one, but I'm pretty sure no. Because the papyrus is not as durable as the animal skins. So there was a more longevity. So the animal skins are what you're going to find most of them written on. The scrolls that I've actually seen, they were all animal skin hides.
What about the place that you visited that was the cone that had all the scrolls from the Old Testament? Were they on animal skins?
Pretty sure it's still animal skin, but they just stitch it together. Again, don't quote me 100% on that, but I'm relatively certain on that one. Just remembering the look of it, remembering what I've seen, it's an animal skin. It's the, not the papyrus, because the papyrus, pretty sure is not as durable. I'm pretty sure it doesn't last as long. Again, not 100% on that one, though.
One last thing. How long was that tour over Yashin?
How long was the
When you went through Yashin, how long?
the tour through Yad Vashem? Is about a half a day. Typically, when we do Yad Vashem, we do the Israeli Museum in the morning. We'll do Yad Vashem in the afternoon, and it takes a good, at least half a day. Funny story. So some of you know Mark, Doc Mark. So we were in Yad Vashem going through the whole museum. Everybody else was out. They were closing the museum. We couldn't find Mark. We're like, what happened to Mark? We're going back and looking, can't find him anywhere. We're like, did we lose him? I do my best not to lose people when they come on tours. I mean, I try my best, as many as come with us, we bring that money back home. It's a goal. You don't want to lose anybody in a foreign country. It's like, how did we lose Mark? He was so enthralled and touched by what he saw in there. He just said, I couldn't move very fast. He was reading everything, taking all. He said it was so very powerful. It probably took a good 3+ hours to go through there because it's intense. It's intense. And it's incredibly well documented history. There are people who try to deny this. There are whole nations who say the Holocaust never happened, which is why Israel has created these places to say, we will not forget. We will not let go of the memory. We know what took place. The Holocaust was very real. But yeah, it's about half a day to get through it. That's why in the evening time, we typically take you like the night spectacular, because you come out of the Holocaust Museum and you're like, oh, you're heavy-hearted and it's difficult. Let's go do something fun. Let's go see some lights and some spectacular. Let's go see some, nice displays, because it just is heavy. It is a heavy thing to see. Other questions? Yes, Raj. So why do they allow them to have the Al-Aqsa Mosque? So the way this goes, mind you, the Jews did not have control of the Temple Mount from 70 AD on. 70 AD, almost 2,000 years ago, Rome comes in, burns it to the ground, casts the Jews out of Jerusalem, and ultimately in 132 AD even renamed it. The name Palestine has never referred to Arabs, by the way, ever, until modern history. Palestine was the name Rome gave to rename Judah because they didn't like the Jews. They were upset with them. So they go, well, who else has lived here other than Jews? The Philistines. The Latin pronunciation of Philistine is Palestine. And that's where the name Palestine comes from. It was given to the Jews in 132 AD. They renamed Jerusalem, may bagong nganalan pa, Aelia Capitolia. That one didn't stick. It came back to Jerusalem eventually. But the whole idea was Rome cast the Jews out. So the Jews didn't control that mound for the next almost 2,000 years. It became the Byzantine Empire, it was Roman Empire. After Rome, it was the Byzantine Empire. After the Byzantine Empire, it was the Ottoman Empire. When the Ottoman Empire fell, it was still under the control of the British Mandate. The British Mandate, when they surrendered it, it was in the War of 1948, Jordan captured it. So Jordan had it after 1948. Israel didn't get it till 1967. So from 70 AD to 1967, Israel did not have the Temple Mount. They get it back. The general of Israel, his name is Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan said, if we dare to touch the Temple Mount, we will have a war we cannot win. There will be 1 billion Muslims coming after us. We will not come out of that. So they made the very difficult decision to instead give it back. Yes, they had conquered all of the West Bank, Gaza Strip. They had conquered the Golan Heights, all of the Sinai Peninsula, all was Israel's. And they said, no, the Temple Mount is yours. Because they feared the consequences if they could not defend against that many Muslims coming against them. So since 1967, although Israel controls Jerusalem, the Temple Mount is still controlled by Jordan. You go up there, it's Muslim Jordanian police, not Jewish. And it was simply to stop a war. But there will come a day, go back to Ezekiel 38, when Iran will drag Russia, also known as Magog, into a war with Israel, with surrounding territories, Turkey, North Africa, Syria in the mix. And they will lose supernaturally. We don't know how the loss will come, but it will be dramatic. And in the wake of that, there will be a man who will stand up. Go back to the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. He will proclaim peace and safety. Peace and safety in a war-torn world, in a world that's falling apart, peace and safety. He will make a covenant with Israel for 7 years to rebuild their temple. The Jews are ready. One of the places you can go to, we don't because it's expensive and it's not that big of a deal to look at it, but the Temple Museum, they have rebuilt everything they need. They have the blueprints. They have made the garments. They have made the instruments. They found the red heifer to dedicate the temple. They have everything they need. They just got to start. Nothing is lacking except for the go signal. And the Jews today believe that the man who rebuilds their temple will be the Messiah. Jesus would say in John chapter 5, you would not receive me, but another will come in his own name. Him you will receive. Speaking of the Antichrist, they will embrace the Antichrist as the Messiah because the Antichrist will rebuild that temple. So there will come a day when it will be rebuilt. But we're waiting for the Antichrist to rise for that to happen. Which is why to this day, Jews still can't go up there. Does that make sense? The dome was constructed in like 660 AD, so almost 1,400 years ago. It didn't get its dome top to more recently. That's genuine gold on the top, by the way. That's not just like a, kind of a glam, glitzy thing. That's actual gold they covered it with. That was the King Hussein of Jordan covered that. It was back maybe 80, 90 years, 100 years ago, whatever it was. But that's a more recent addition. But the dome itself is about 1,400 years old. But it is not the holy site. That's the catch. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is at the southern end, that gray dome at the very end, that's the holy site for Muslims. The dome is just a monument, not where they worship. But still, if you touched it, it would be war. Which is why it's interesting, the Dome of the Spirit is further north in line with the Gate Beautiful. Totally could build a temple there and put the Dome of the Rock in the court of the Gentiles. Any other questions before we get a little break? Marapa? Let's take 10 minutes and we'll come back and we'll head off to Turkey real quick. All righty. All right, we're going to cross off. We've gotten to the airport. We're hopping back on Turkish Airlines because we're going from Turkish Airlines. We're back to Ben Gurion Airport, dropping off the rental cars. We're flying back out. Short little ride, about 2 hours in a plane. And you're going to come to the city of Istanbul. Istanbul is a unique city. It is the only city in the whole world that spreads both Asia and Europe. It's in 2 continents. Or if you're here on the left side, that's Europe. When you're on the right side, that's Asia. So the city actually covers 2 continents. Where we want to get to is the downtown, old. And there's just 3 spots we'll real quickly cover. We only spent about a day here. They're just good history, not necessarily biblical history. The first place we is called Hagia Sophia, which is right here in the center. Hagia Sophia is the church called Saint Sophia. Hagia means holy. So it's Saint Sophia Church. It was built, pay attention, 1,500 years ago. This is back, not maybe 400 or 500 years after the time of Jesus Christ. The size of that building, by the way, is enormous. It stands from floor to ceiling about width. The way it goes across is about another probably 100. Massive inside of that building. It's unbelievable that that big of a dome, that large, 1,500 years. And the more it's still standing. Asasubong Tindagpa. Earthquake-prone area. This was an extraordinary, amazing building. It was built by the Byzantine Empire. Bit of history. When Constantine converted Rome to Christianity, he wanted to reform a capital city. He wanted to get away from Rome because Rome was baggage. So he reformed a new city here in what is modern-day Turkey. It's Asia Minor back in those days, called Constantinople. So Constantinople, it is the city of Constantine. And this became the heart of the foundation of what's known as the Eastern Roman Empire, for there were 2. You had the Eastern Empire and the Western Empire. The Western Empire became the Catholic Church and endures to this day. The Eastern Empire was actually the stronger of them at first, but ultimately fell to the most grand church in all of the world, for this was the Grand World War I, but it recently has just been reconverted back into a mosque. It is a mosque again, which got me in some trouble, if I'm honest. So we're in Turkey. Took everybody to Hagia Sophia. We went inside. It was quite beautiful inside to show them the whole interior of the building. The problem was, as I began to give them the history of the Byzantine Empire, there was a Turkish man watching us. You could tell he was not happy. After about 10 minutes, he grabs me and says, "You need to come with me." Okay. Outside we went. He said, "You're a tour guide and you shouldn't be because you're not licensed." I said, "I'm just here with people from my church and we're just talking about the history." He said, "That counts, that qualifies. I need to write you up." So I actually got written up officially for talking about Jesus in Turkey. Go figure. Needless to say, they didn't arrest me, so I was happy for that. I was more cautious thereafter, but we wasn't arrested for that. Word to the wise, be cautious when you're in Turkey, especially if you're talking about Jesus and they think you're a tour guide. But we bussed down there and bussed back. It was a quick little ride from the airport. Part of not just seeing Hagia Sophia, let me see if I can get you a bit of a description. This is the outside. I want you to see the scope of that. Look at the size of the building. These were added afterwards, by the way. These minarets, they are additions that were put there by the Muslims. Those were not part of the original building, but this building itself, outside of that, is 1,500 years old. It is absolutely an amazing building that still stands. This is the interior space. Give you an idea of what it's like on the inside. It is absolutely gorgeous and amazing to the size of it. There is a rumor, I've never been able to confirm this, there's a rumor that much of the marble in here was confiscated from the Temple of Artemis that ultimately, if you read about back to Acts chapter 19, that wonder of the ancient world, the temple of Artemis there in the city of Ephesus, when it was destroyed, they cannibalized the marble, and they actually brought and built Hagia Sophia with it. Again, I've never been able to confirm that, but I have heard that rumor. So it does have a connection to Acts 19 in that way. Now, from Hagia Sophia, you do go a little bit north, and you come to what's called Topkapi Palace. Now, the only interesting thing about this for our sakes, movie Aladdin. The Sultan, the whole idea of a Middle Eastern palace, of having that whole picture of, the Arabian Nights. This is what all of that is based off of. This is the one Sultan, the one Topkapi Palace. This is where all of those mythologies and stories come out of. So kind of interesting to kind of see that. You're overlooking, by the way, the straits that cross over from Europe to Asia on the far side. So kind of a famous place. A little bit to the south of Hagia Sophia, you have the Blue Mosque. The Blue Mosque is kind of entertaining. So here's Hagia Sophia. This is a courtyard or a kind of a grass area, and at the bottom is the Blue Mosque. It is the Muslim attempt to duplicate Hagia Sophia. We would call it a cheap Chinese duplicate. It looks similar, not nearly as grand, nearly as nice, but 1,000 years newer. Does say a lot, by the way, about Hagia Sophia. Although this is 1,000 years older, it is much more impressive than what Blue Mosque ever will be. So kind of neat to see. Man, they built it right back in the days. Underneath Hagia Sophia, you have what's called the Basilica Cisterns. It holds about 4 million liters of water. This was the main water source for the city of Istanbul, Constantinople, for the better part of 1,000 years. Absolutely incredible ruins underneath. You need to go see this. This is just a big cistern to hold water, because again, you're in a very dry, arid climate. This is where they would provide water for the city. They did so for about a millennia, about 1,000 years. And then if you go a little bit further here to the west, you come to the Grand Bazaar, which again, if you like shopping, I don't know how many of you enjoy shopping. If shopping is something that you have a good time with, it is basically about 10 city blocks worth of shopping markets. So it's a fun place to go, get souvenirs. Welcome to downtown Istanbul, all kinds of good stuff down there. That's Istanbul. We're only there for about 4 or 5 hours. Hop on a plane, and this is what I want to get to. You head down to the south. For when you come to the southern end of Turkey, let me open it up for you. You come to the 7 churches. You land in the city of Izmir. It is the 3rd largest city in all of Turkey, quite large, about 4 million people. Lots of traffic and really, really, really tiny streets. Got us in trouble on our way back, actually, with the tiny streets. But Izmir, big, big, big city. But from Izmir, rather than going to see, there is a ruins there of one of the 7 churches, but we finished there rather than start. We head to the south about an hour and a half to the city of Ephesus. What you're dealing with now is you in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. These are the 7 letters Jesus wrote through John to the 7 churches of Asia Minor. They are basically one big loop. There's actually a road that connects them today. There was always kind of a highway between them. These are 7 major metropolitan areas that are there in the western portion of Turkey. So the first one we go to is Ephesus, which is by far the largest of them. Ephesus was a mega city, probably 150,000 to 300,000 people back in the days when Paul would have been there and when John would have written the letter to the church. The background you're looking at right here, this is called the Celsus Library. It is second only in the ancient world to the libraries of Alexandria itself in Egypt. It was one of the main depositories of knowledge and information in the Roman world. All that's left today is the facade of it. The library itself in the back has long since collapsed. But absolutely incredible to see just how much money was in Ephesus. Look at the size of that Celsus Library. And if you think that's big, wait till you see the theater. This is the theater of Ephesus. How big is it? Really big. It can seat, to this very day, and they still use it. It is an active theater, 25,000 people can sit inside of this theater. What takes place here is a very important biblical event. Go back to Acts chapter 19. Recall that Paul, there in the city for 3 years teaching the Bible, turned the city upside down. Many people were getting saved. One man in particular, his name was Demetrius. His work was making the idols, mga revolto na lang, for the goddess Artemis, or Amoman, the goddess Diana. Same name, just two different languages, one Latin, one Greek. This goddess, by the way, was the goddess of fertility. There was a lot of promiscuity in Ephesus. We'll get into that in a moment, but it wasn't a very moral place. The goddess herself, there's images of them. They still sell them there. I found that ironic. You can actually still buy an idol of the goddess Diana in Ephesus. She is multi-breasted, like many, it's really weird looking breasts. And that's the idol that they had there because of this whole fertility thing. So it's not appropriate. Don't take your kids in to buy that, please. But that's the goddess Diana. This is what Demetrius made, and he was losing business. So what did he do? He starts a riot. 25,000 people chanting through the streets of Ephesus, "Great is Diana of Artemis. We have the great temple of Artemis. There's none like her. She is worshipped throughout all of the Roman Empire." And they pile into this theater, all 25,000 of them, punno gid. And for an hour straight, they're just chanting, "Great is Artemis, great is Artemis." What does Paul do? I love Paul. Paul says, "Let me in there. Let me in there. That's 25,000 people that I can preach to right now. Let me go." They said, "Paul, not a chance. You walk in there right now, you're a dead man. They will kill you." They physically restrained Paul to keep him out of this theater because they knew he was a dead man if he walked in because the crowd was in a frenzy. In fact, they had to rush Paul out. They had to physically pull Paul out of Ephesus and get him to another city for fear of his life. Paul wrote this later on in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. He says, "I want to tell you, when we were in Asia," this is Asia, Asia being a region, a province, not talking about the continent. In Asia, Ephesus, we were pressed beyond measure, above our strength, in so much that we despaired of our very life. We had the sentence. It killed Paul not to preach. It killed Paul to have 25,000 people gathered together, tried to deceive who needed to hear about Jesus Christ, and to be knocked out, to be out of the city. Paul said it was the hardest thing he ever had to go through in Ephesus. But interestingly, the history of what takes place. I don't think I have a picture of it here, but when you're there in Ephesus, and there was a lot of money, there's a very wealthy region, but in one particular place, as you're walking along the road, there's a footprint carved into the street. Now mind you, it's been 2,000 years, so it's a good carving. It stuck around, it lasted. Why did someone carve their footprint into a street? And there's some letters next to it. This way to the brothel. This way to the prostitutes. Ephesus, highly immoral, highly questionable in their choices as far as their promiscuity, very immoral in their worship of other gods. And you're going, what happened to this city? What happened to the temple of Artemis? Well, just a little bit away, look on our map, that's the ruins. Up here is the temple. This is the temple of Artemis. So you're maybe a 5-minute little drive away. When you get there, one pillar is all that remains of the great goddess Artemis, the great temple, which was at one point in time the largest temple in the Roman world. One pillar is left. Because the city in mass turned to Jesus Christ. It became the home and the heart of one of the greatest revivals in the ancient world in the Roman Empire. Because even though Paul was frustrated in his day, the Lord planted seeds and great work took place here. There was an amazing revival. Ultimately, this is where he became a pastor. And after him, some of the greatest church early fathers like Polycarp all came out of Ephesus. Amazing place, incredible, awesome to see the fact that Jesus overcame it. Although they still do sell the idols of Artemis. That's Artemis right there. If you're curious of what the idols look like, yeah, that's her. 2,000 years later, and the same thing, Demetrius, still there. Go for it. Anyways, from Ephesus, we're going to cross over. It's about a 3-hour car ride. Takes a bit of time. You're going to follow, if you're looking at, you notice how there's mountains on the north? Mountains on the south, but there's a bit of a valley in between that the road follows. You're just going to follow that all the way over. That's always been a major roadway. Over into this little valley over here, where you have 3 different places we want to look at. The first one right in the middle is the city of Laodicea. This had the wealthiest of all of the churches. It was the 7th and final church that Jesus wrote to. He told them, I know you think you are rich. You think mangaranangid ka mo. But I tell you, you are wretched, poor, blind, naked, and miserable. Jesus said, you have external wealth, you do not have internal wealth. You're missing what matters most. You're missing the gospel. You're missing what matters, which is Jesus Christ. Funny, out of all of the churches, this is the only one that there actually still is a church. Go to Ephesus, you see the ruins of the city, no church. Smyrna, Thyatira, Pergamos, Philadelphia, no churches. The only one that actually has the ruins of a church is Laodicea, and it's huge. You can fit 1,000 people inside of this church. Massive, beautiful, very wealthy, but no Jesus. In fact, he told them something interesting. He told them, I wish you were either hot or cold. Now, pay attention, this gets interesting. This is one of those you need to be there to really appreciate what Jesus is saying. Because did you ever wonder, why did Jesus say that? Hot or cold? And now, I get it. Jesus says, I wish you were hot, on Lord. But I wish you were cold? I don't want you to have a heart for the Lord. What is he talking about? If you stand in the church of Laodicea, you can see 2 other cities. One over here on the left. It is the city of Pamukkale, modern name. Biblical, called Hierapolis. Hierapolis has natural hot springs. In fact, if you look, you can see in the picture here, do you see where Jen's pointing off and you see what looks like snow? That's not snow. That's mineral deposits, lime deposits from hot springs running down these hills. That's Hierapolis. But if you look the other direction, you see this tall mountain. That's Mount Cadmus. Mount Cadmus is over here. That is the city of Colossae, also where you have the book of Colossians written to. The whole region, by the way, is known as the region of Galatia. So when you read the book of Galatians, this is Galatians. This is Galatia. When you read the book of Colossians, that's the city of Colossae. In fact, Hierapolis and Laodicea are mentioned in the letter to the church of Galatia. They're both in that letter. So look to the right. You see Mount Cadmus, which rises up about 3,000 meters above sea level. Snow-capped year-round. Cold, refreshing water flows out of Colossae down there from Mount Cadmus. Cold water comes from Colossae. Hot water comes from Hierapolis. Where do they meet? Laodicea. And it becomes lukewarm. And the idea is, I wish you would be warm, therapeutic, healing like the hot springs of Hierapolis. Or you would be cold, refreshing as the cold springs out of Colossae. But tunga na lang ka. And because you're in the middle, because you are lukewarm, masuka ko sa inyo. I'll spew you out. And it's amazing when you stand there, because when you're looking at the place, you're like, I get it. You understand visually what Jesus was talking about to this city, this wealthy church, who lived a compromised life. The ruins here are actually some of the best in all of Turkey. They are extraordinary ruins. It's one of the beautiful places to go to. It's extensive ruins. This is the church right here. They've got it covered. Obviously, the roof is new. That's not original. They added that afterwards for protection. The church is underneath. But you have multiple temples nearby. The temple to Diana, I think the one over there to Dionysius. But you have different temples and even a theater on the far side. There's another huge theater they're excavating here in Laodicea. Beautiful ruin. That's Hierapolis again. There you can see the white off in the distance. Beautiful ruins, wealthy city. Unfortunately, compromised. One of the worst of the 7 churches. But we will spend a day also in Hierapolis. That's not snow. That is hot springs. That is lime deposits that are running down the hills. That's what you looked at from a distance up close. It is actually extraordinarily beautiful. It's an amazing place to go. These are what they call these thermal pools here. I forget the name of them, the travertine pools, I think they name these. They're cascading down, and the look is absolutely gorgeous. From the top, there's hot water springs that just cascade down, and they do have therapeutic value. To this very day, people go there to actually soak in these hot springs if they've got any ailments. Supposedly it lowers your blood pressure, cures arthritis, it does all kind of great things, if you want to believe that. But they come here for their therapeutic value. And they've got a gorgeous theater there as well. In fact, what's unique about the theater, in particular in Hierapolis, is notice the back is still intact here. That's unique. I told you that there in Bet Shan, they would have had a back to the theater. This is the one place you can actually see the backing still in place. That's what the back of a theater would have looked like, and that's there in the ruins of the city of Hierapolis. And you also, if you want to, can go up on hot air balloons. We actually had a great time doing this. It was super, super, super fun. Everybody kind of got together. We rented a hot air balloon. It actually was rather inexpensive. I was surprised there. And they'll take you up over the hot springs, which is super neat to be able to see. Takes you up over in the air. And you can float over the natural hot springs and get a chance to see. And you can also do parasailing. That I did not do. That's Mark. Mark was willing to do that. My thought was, I know me, I'm not small, I'm not sure you want to put in a parachute and trust me to land. I thought, no, I won't go there. They said it was a lot of fun, good time. But that's all Pamukkale, Hierapolis, kind of neat to see. We usually spend an extra day there. The thought behind an extra day is you've been going for about 10, 12 days now. You're kind of tired. We run you pretty ragged. You know, some days we're having you walk 12 kilometers in a single day. We're going, take a day, relax, go into the thermal pools, ride a hot air balloon if you want to, catch your breath before we finish off our trip. From Laodicea, we're going to start heading back up around. We're going to take this land. You can kind of see again where you've got between the mountains, up to the northwest. You come to the city of Philadelphia. Was one of only 2 churches that said nothing bad about. They were a church that was small. They weren't many in number. They didn't have a whole lot of wealth. Pero buot sila, Jesus Christ, nothing bad against them. He said, you're good. These pillars are not from the church. They are from a 6th century church built over the ruins of the church in the days of Philadelphia. Modern structure, as far as time goes, about 1,400 years old rather than 2,000 years old. But it does mark the place where they believe the church would have been during the day. Now you continue moving around. You come to one of my favorite spots, which is the church of Sardis. Now a couple things in Sardis. This is a Roman building. It is a gymnasium. So if you thought the trend of going to the gym and working out was something new, no. Been around for 2,000 years. They've had gyms as far back as the time of the Roman Empire. People used to love them. They were quite large, 2-story buildings where people would go and do their exercise. It showed the focus on the external rather than the internal. Sardis was an interesting church. Jesus said, I know your reputation. You think you are alive. I say you are dead. There was no real life in this church. It had lost its way, focused on the wrong things. It had gone astray. It was a very large community of Jews. In fact, this is one of the only synagogues you'll find from the Roman Empire outside of Israel. It was so large it could seat 1,000 people. So it was an extremely large Jewish population in Sardis. It was an extremely influential culture. Have you ever heard of the story of Midas touch? Old parable, King Midas, whatever he touched turned into gold, comes from Sardis. This is where the story of Midas touch came from. This is where coins were first invented. The first city in all of history to ever use coins for money came from Sardis. Wealthy, influential, focused on the external, lots of Jews, but Jesus says, you're dead. There was nothing there to give them life. It also has another temple of Artemis, this one more intact than the one in Ephesus. This is the temple of Artemis in Sardis. So, kind of gives you a little bit of idea there. That's Hillel jumping. Here gives you an aerial view. So here's your gymnasium. This is the synagogue. See how big it is. It actually carries over to both sides. So all of this and all of this. This is all one synagogue. The Jews would meet quite large. Again, 1,000 people could have met inside of it. And then we have a market that's also been uncovered. So quite an extraordinary room. From Sardis, you come to probably the smallest of the ruins. There's not much here. But the city of Thyatira. Thyatira is a modern city, so much of the ruins are not exposed, they're not viewable, they're underneath current modern structures. That's why there's not much there. In the very heart of the city, there's one courtyard where they've exposed some of it. But Thyatira was most famous for one name, Jezebel. For the Lord said, I know your works, you do a lot of good, but I have one thing against you. You allow Jezebel to be in your midst, and he specifically condemns them for immorality, sexual immorality. Apparently it was rampant within the church. So it was the major problem here in Thyatira, compromised church. We call it the compromised church, and this was the place where ultimately, but that brings us to the sixth of the churches, which is the church of Pergamum. And I do really enjoy Pergamum. It is probably the greatest of the ruins, the best of all 7 churches in Ephesus in a lot of ways. When you are in Pergamum, there are 2 locations you go to. One is up here by the lake. This is a high hill, probably about 400 meters high. It is called the Acropolis. The place. You go up there, it is full of temples. You have the temple to Dionysius, that's the god of wine. You have the temple to Trajan, that's the god of war. You have the temple up there's lots of temples. The temple to Zeus, to that in a minute. But when you walk up there, you obviously see that it's a very pagan place, beautiful, high, overlooking the city below, but pagan. What's interesting is, come to the temple of Zeus. The temple of Zeus in particular has been removed. All that's left is the foundation that used to be there. The temple itself was pulled out and actually shipped stone by stone to Germany. It's in a museum there. Has been there for about 100 years. Why do we care about the temple of Zeus? When John wrote, when Jesus gave this parable, story, this letter to the church of Pergamos in Revelation chapter 2, he said, I know where you dwell. You dwell in the place where Satan's seat is. Stop right there. Satan is not omnipresent. Satan can only be in one place at one time. Meaning somewhere on earth, now today, Satan is there. Where is that place? U.S., if we're honest, let's be... Most likely that's where he ended up. I could name some cities that he might be in, Las Vegas or some others, but that's probably it. Jesus is much there, Satan's there. But where was Satan in the days? Where was Satan when John wrote this? Pergamos. This is where Satan was. That's what Jesus tells this church. You are starting a church where Satan literally has his throne. What was his throne? Who was the greatest of the gods of the Greeks? Who was number one god? Zeus. So where would Satan sit, do you think? Might as well go for the best. Sit in the seat of Zeus. The temple of Zeus in Pergamum, up in the Acropolis, was a huge throne. That's what the temple was. And so it's very possible, kind of humbling when you get there to look at this, you're looking at this place going one point in time, not now, no longer. But at one point in time, this is where Satan sat. And I got to say, that always humbles me. Can you imagine if God was writing a letter and he said, I know where you guys are, and behold that I'm praying for you because I know that's where Satan is. Jesus, I think God's calling me to a different city. Might be time to move. I don't want to hear that Satan is dwelling where I live. That sounds intimidating. Yet that's what Pergamos was told, and it's wild when you go and see it. See the throne, see this place, this temple of Zeus, where very likely you're talking about the actual dwelling place of Satan himself in the day. But when you come down off of the mountain, you come down into a place called the Asclepion. Let me give you a couple more shots of... This is looking out on the theater there up in the Acropolis. This is actually the theater. It's the steepest theater in the world. There up on the Acropolis, the top by Pergamum, it actually goes down and overlooks the whole valley down below. Quite impressive. Here's my picture. I thought I had this one. That's the ruins of the Temple of Zeus. So there's your seat of Satan. This is the actual temple in Germany. This is what they pulled out. So that used to be on top of that foundation stone there in Pergamum. So this likely is not seat of Satan once upon a time. I'll give you the aerial view here real quick. So you can see the theater. There's your temple, Dionysius, Trajan. Trajan's down below here. Dionysius up top. Overlooking the lake in the background, that's the Acropolis of Pergamum. But as you come down into the valley, you come down to what's called the Asclepion. Giving you new words, I appreciate that. But Asclepion is the god Asclepius. Asclepius, you know the symbol. Whenever you do medical, what do you see? You see a pole with a snake. Ever wonder where that came from? Why do we represent healing as a pole with a snake? It is the representation of the god Asclepius. So the Asclepion, here's another word for this, is a hospital. This is your ancient Roman version of a hospital. This is where they would come to be healed. We were reading, kind of funny as we walked in, the instructions, and there were some conditions to who was allowed in. If you were too old, you weren't allowed. Because let's face it, you're probably not going to make it, you're not going to be healed, and so we don't want you in here, you'll ruin our reputation. No old people allowed. If you are pregnant, sorry, too risky, not allowed in. If you have a headache, yes. Headaches are allowed, because we're pretty sure we can take care of that. So there are a lot of conditions to coming into this healing place, but needless to say, this is where you came to be healed. One of their key functions was they had a tunnel. Still there to this day, and there are holes in the top of the tunnel. What they would do is they would fill the hall with mist, so you get some nice mist going in the tunnel. And you would start to walk through. And as you're walking through, your doctors would be on top whispering down to you, "You are feeling better. Maayo ka na imalawas. You're going to feel great. You're doing good now." And so by the time you get to the end of the tunnel, of course, you're not feeling awesome because all these people have told you you're okay now. And they would give you a white stone. They would give you a white stone to show that you were now good. Why is that interesting? Go back to the book of Revelation, chapter 2 with Pergamos, and look at the promise that is given to the one who overcomes. To he who overcomes, I will give a white stone. And on that stone will be a new name. Again, geography so often changes your whole perspective on what Jesus is talking about. What do you mean a white stone? Jesus is saying, I'm the one who heals you. It's not a tunnel. It's not some quack doctors up on the top whispering, some kind of a good, feel kind of a comment to you. No, it's Jesus that you need. It is Jesus who gives you a new name, a new life. He's the one who ultimately heals us. And you see that there at the Asclepion. Kind of amazing. But we finish up our tour. A couple more looks at this. That's Dr. Bob. Here's a view of the Asclepion kind of from the top view. So here you have the little theater. It's a small theater here, not very large. Probably seats maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people at most. Something like Ephesus. But the Asclepion, the tunnel that we were looking at, wait, it'll spin around. Keep turning. There is over there. There's your tunnel running over there. But from there, we're going to finish back up where we started. So you're making a big loop. You come back around. back to the ocean. You're going to come back to the city of Izmir. Takes a couple hours to get there. When you come back to Izmir, right in the center of the city, which is why, by the way, we never got to see this. I saw it when we were there. We did a tour. First, we're kind of scouting this out back in 2019, and we did get into Izmir. We got into the ruins. When we went in 2022, we were there in the city. We were supposed to go see the ruins. There was so much traffic, and the roads were so tiny and so confusing, we got lost. And it actually ended up running out of time. We had to get back to the airport to catch our flight. So we got close to the ruins. We were outside with bars. This is kind of humorous. So we didn't get into the ruins of Smyrna. We got to the outside behind the bars. Why is it funny we were behind bars? Because when Jesus writes to the church in Smyrna, he knows that I know you're going to be persecuted. Some of you will end up in prison. And we were behind bars. So when we got to Smyrna, we did end up behind bars, just saying. But the ruins themselves are rather remarkable. This city was unique in that the greatest worship here was of the Caesar. They had emperor worship. And because of that, this had the greatest persecution of any of the 7 cities, which is what made this city in particular one of only 2, them and Philadelphia, who Jesus never said anything bad about. They were persecuted, that made them dependent upon the Lord, that gave them the ability to be a godly church. And that's the church of Smyrna, which finishes up our tour of the 7 churches. Catch our plane back to Turkey, Istanbul, and we're flying back to the Philippines, coming on back home. Questions? Anybody got anything they want to add?
So the original temple of Zeus is in Turkey?
There is a major temple of Zeus. It's not the original. The original would be in Greece, but the one in Pergamus was the largest in that Asia Minor area. That area of Pergamus, the city of Pergamus, would have been the capital of the region, one of the key cities that the Romans had there, and they established very strong worship of their gods there. And so that temple was the primary one in that region. And apparently, important enough that Satan said, I'll make that my place too. I found that so humbling. You don't think about where is Satan in the world right now. I don't typically think about that. Sa si Satan subong. I don't want to know. I'd rather not know. But to have someone tell you, sa imo syudad. Can you imagine hearing that? That was Pergamus.
I do not want to hear that he is in the Philippines.
Much preferred if he's not in the Philippines. Much more preferred too, he's not in Bacolod. No. Try some other city, please. Not here. Other questions? Finish up? Yes, Raj. Yes. The Asclepius is based upon that, although ironic, isn't it, that you find the same symbology? What Israel did, mind you, you're back in Numbers chapter 21. So Numbers 21, Israel complains. Nagreklamo sila against God. They're rebelling against the Lord. They're saying, God, why did you bring us out here in the wilderness to die, to wander for 40 years? They were there because they had doubted the Lord. It wasn't God's fault. They were wandering. It was their fault. Yet they complained. So God said, okay, I'll send venomous snakes out amongst you. And they were biting and killing the people. They repented. We've sinned. Sorry, God said that. So God had Moses make a serpent out of bronze and lift it up on a pole. Very simple. If you're bit by a snake, look to the pole and you'll live. Don't look to the pole, you die. People looked, made sense, right? Easy. Jesus picked up on this. And this is, by the way, is an amazing point. John chapter 3, speaking to Nicodemus, just as the serpent was lifted up in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. Here's the idea. We have been bitten by what? An enemy. A serpent. Sin. Satan. And it brings death. What's our solution? Look to the cross. Look to the cross, you live. Don't look to the cross, you die. But you won't understand that unless you understand number 1. It's John 3 that puts off of number 21 that has that same imagery that ultimately is picked up by the god Asclepius. Same imagery, the snake is there. Satan's not creative. He's not inventive. So it's not directly tied to it, but yes, it is the same imagery. Anybody else? Don't want to hold you. We're at 4 o'clock, so you have endured well. But any final comments, any final thoughts before we dismiss you? Yes.
Among 7 churches where still Christian church stand 7.
Turkey is 99% Muslim. Very, very few Christians there. In some of the larger cities like Izmir, I imagine you probably could find churches and more than a couple. But if you were to go to Ephesus, by the way, Ephesus isn't a city anymore. There is a new city that's nearby, it's built more modern. But for the most part, those biblical cities, Ephesus, Laodicea, getting into Pergamus, getting into Thyatira, those cities as they were don't exist anymore. So, sad to say, no. That's a sad statement on the failure of the church in that particular area of the world. But there's still hope. There is a revival coming, and it will be a good one. Yes.
According to the church, 7 churches that you have mentioned, is it stated in the Revelation? Would that be literally the statement for that churches, or what could be taken as believers?
So when you deal with the 7 churches, there are 3 possible interpretations as to what Jesus is talking about, and likely all 3 are correct. They are 7 literal churches. So Jesus is speaking to the church of Ephesus, the church of Laodicea, the church of Thyatira, the church of Pergamus, the church of Sardis, the church of Smyrna. So he's dealing with a specific church. That's for sure. We know that they existed. You also are probably dealing with kinds of churches. Meaning, maybe a particular church, Asa Subong, is like Ephesus. Buot sila, pero wala palangga. They've lost their first love. O kapasi, mangaran na namang kay Laodicea, but they do not have the focus on Jesus Christ. Or maybe they're about tradition, religion. So there are still those kinds of churches today, so we can relate to them, because what kind of church are we? Hopefully we're like a Philadelphia. We all want to be Philadelphia. Philadelphia or Smyrna. We like the ones that have no rebukes. Hopefully that's who we are. But needless to say, they apply to us today. But there is a third interpretation that's curious. It's the history of the church. Beginning with Ephesus, which is the first church, you move on into the compromised church, Pergamus, which is the church, by the way, where you see the fact that ultimately the Constantine came up and he converted over Roman Empire into Christianity. Then you get to Thyatira, which is this church that has Jezebel within it, these false doctrines within it, these mixed belief, which is thought to be the Catholic Church. On Reformation, which is Sardis. You have a reputation, you're alive, but you've just gone into dead works. Moving on into Philadelphia, where you get this revival. Although small, it's a revival church, but then you get in the last days church, which is Laodicea, which is rich, wealthy. They have all kinds of things, but they've lost Jesus. And so there is a good picture painted that the 7 churches is actually the history of the church from Jesus until today. So how does it apply? Probably all 3. They were literal churches, they are kinds of churches, and they're also the history of the church, which makes those letters to the 7 churches really powerful. Very, very cool. Yes? Second.
stumping, that was one of the things that they're talking about, lukewarm water got together.
Two questions. First of all, Smyrna would be the second church. Ephesus, which is the first church, that's the apostolic church, that's the book of Acts, where they had good works, but they really quickly walked away from the love of Jesus. Your second one, thank you, is Smyrna, which is under the Roman persecution. When you had the Roman emperors, in the first 2-3 centuries, were very violently opposed to the church. Nero and others like him that murdered Christians in great numbers. There's Smyrna. And then on into, ultimately, Pergamos, which is the compromised, Thyatira, which is the blended church where you have the false prophets coming in, so on and so forth. Your second question, dealing with Laodicea, does not have that smell Hierapolis does. Because Hierapolis is where the hot springs come out and they do have a sulfur odor at some points. But that water does flow to Laodicea, so it is there. But the origin of it's Hierapolis. The wealth of Laodicea was two things. One, it was geographical, because they were, if you remember looking at the map, so take a peek at where Laodicea is. So you're at this crossroads here, where you're watching these valleys. You can see the valleys flow into here and flow out. So there are major crossroads within that region of Asia Minor, so there was a lot of commerce that flowed through. They also were famous for two other things. These are ironic. Black wool. They had a particular breed of sheep there that the wool was naturally black. And it was very valuable, sought after, and it brought them a great deal of wealth. They were also famous for an eye salve. They had a particular healing salve that they would sell all over that was very popular in the Roman Empire, which is interesting because Jesus says, "Come unto me and I will give you eye salve that you might see." And they were actually famous for that, which is what Jesus was relating to. And that's where a lot of their wealth came from. Their geography, their black sheep, as well as their medicinal salve that they would use. Other questions, my Iban? Wala na? Well, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you coming out and spending the day, getting into Israel. Hopefully it was an opportunity for you to see the Bible in a way and in a light that you've not seen it before. You can see the chance to see the sights, see the words, see the places, and hopefully grasp this a little better. It's not just a book. It is history. It is truth. It is life. Let's pray. Salamat liwat Ginoo para sa nihapon, Father. We thank you for the time you give us to gather together, Lord. We thank you for the opportunity to be able to walk through your land, to see, Lord, Israel, to see the 7 churches of Asia Minor, Lord, and to realize, Lord, just how true it is. Lord, we live in a world that will love us to question the word that you've given to us. Make us doubt and wonder, does it really have any relevance today? Is it even real? When the evidence and the facts are overwhelming, it's so clear, so easy to see. Yes, they're absolutely true. They're absolutely correct. And Lord, your word is not just right. It is life. And so, Lord, we just pray that you would stir our heart with that. Give us a confidence, a boldness in our faith as we learn more, grow more, follow more after you and all that we say and do. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Amen. Thank you.